For some reason, which was not really explained, Nancy Pelosi went to Oxford in the UK to debate on populism. The actual title of the debate is "This House Believes That Populism is a Threat to Democracy." So naturally, you would invite her to go over there and talk about how we prosecute our political opponents, we stop First Amendment protected activities from happening, and all of the other sort of great things that come out of DC. After she gave her typical speech and talking points about Orange Man bad, there's a guy named Winston Marshall who gets to give the opposing viewpoint, and he started off his speech with a pretty good line.
When I was a boy, woman meant someone who didn't have a cock.
One thing she said that jumped out as dumb, even for Nancy Pelosi, was that voters are blocked from making rational decisions, which would be voting for Democrats in this case, because of their views on God. And that's just a little insight into how the establishment thinks in DC. The government is your God, the government is your ruler. That's how it works. And if you push back on that, then you're just dumb, ignorant, racist, or brainwashed. The full speech by Pelosi is like 15 or 20 minutes, so I just have the portion here that I found the most relevant. So without further ado, watch Nancy Pelosi represent America in the worst way possible.
The Speaker Emerita, Nancy Pelosi, to close the case for the proposition.
Good evening. Thank you all very much for this very stimulating evening. Mr. President, congratulations to you and your officers for bringing us together to discuss this very important challenge. The proposition says that it is a threat to democracy. It didn't say it will cause it. It said it is a threat. So remember what the proposition is. Now listen attentively to our two friends here in their description of populism, and our white tie and tail gentleman and his comments. And you know what? They make a very compelling argument. It would have been so appropriate 200 years ago in the time of Andrew Jackson. It's an old notion of populism. For today, I always like to put down temporal markers. For today, how populism weighs in is in a way that is different. Voltaire said, if you want to debate with me, define your terms. Well, let's define what is happening with populism today. Populism is sprung on some of the people that have been named here, put forth with an ethno-nationalist populism. That in our country, we see nationalism, isolationism. We had a fight to get the bill that we got last week, and generated by an ethnic negativity about immigrants, yeah, incumbents too, immigrants, people who are different from them, these people, and the rest. Our problem with, I don't think mob rule is a definition of democracy. What is democracy? Let's define democracy. Democracy is the rule of law. Democracy is free and fair elections. Democracy is about the independent judiciary. It's about freedom of the press, to have transparency and to have accountability of elected officials to the people. It's about all of that, and that is everything that the populist regime in Washington, D.C. is against. Populism is about fighting the ethno-nationalistic populism, as is the threat to democracy, is about threatening what they call elites. A free press. No thanks. Free press. It's about fighting issues that relate to free and fair elections, where we have voter suppression to the nth degree under this regime, and a resistance to passing the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Act, all of that, because they want to contain who votes. Now, the issue of independent judiciary. We owe so much to the UK, or England as it was, when it put forth so many things at Runnymede, England. And one of them was trial by jury. When King John came, the barons who were there they had 12 chairs. And what sprang from that was a jury of your peers, 12 peers. And that sprang from the Magna Carta, and something that we hold dear in our country. Right now, we see trial by jury threatened by vicious assaults on the jurors. So when we talk about populism and we talk about democracy, let's understand our terms today, not 200 years ago, but today. And if you are humored by some of the, Ted Cruz and people like that, that may be humorous to you, but it ain't funny to us because it has a direct impact on what's happening. Now, here's the thing that is so sad about all of this. These people who are populist and go out there and make all these claims take advantage of people who have legitimate economic concerns. In this day and age, people are concerned, and some of you have heard me say this before, are concerned about innovation. How are they and their families going to thrive and survive economically in a new era of innovation? They're concerned about globalization. They're concerned about immigration. They're concerned about anything new because it's not familiar to them. And so along comes a snake oil salesman, sells them a bill of goods, and then takes office, and the only legislation put forth is a bill that gives, a tax bill that gives 83% of the benefits to the top 1%, that has legislation to take away their health care. If that isn't enough for you, when we didn't have the bill to go give aid to Ukraine and the rest, the speaker said to me, I can't do it until I do the budget bill. What was holding up the budget bill? After giving a $2 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest 1% in our country, $2 trillion added to the national debt, unpaid for. The big issue that held us up at the end was something called WIC, food for women, infants and children, for new families. We can't afford to give that food. It's going to add to the national debt. That's what these purveyors of populism sold a bill of goods to these people who grasped it because they had legitimate concerns that have to be respected and they have to be addressed. But the fact is that democracy can, since your 200-year-ago version about Andrew Jackson and all that, so much has happened that our distinguished person, I don't know your name, but thank you for your pro-argument. We've seen demagogues come down the pike, destroy the press. What do the Republicans say? Fake news. So they're diminishing that in the eyes of these poor souls who are looking for some answers. We've given them to them, but they're blocked by some of their views on guns. They have the 3 Gs, guns, gays, God, that would be a woman's right to choose. And the cultural issues cloud some of their reception of an argument that really is in their interest. I don't agree with you that we don't accuse people of not knowing what they're doing. They know what their personal interest is. We respect that. But the fact is that using whether it's people different from me, nationalism, populism, is a very dangerous threat to democracy, not just in America where we're seeing it play out, but in the whole world.
To Mr. Winston Marshall to close the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, words have a tendency to change meaning. When I was a boy, woman meant someone who didn't have a cock. Populism has become a word used synonymously with racist, we've heard ethno-nationalist, with bigot, with hillbilly, redneck, with deplorables. Elites use it to show their contempt for ordinary people. This is a recent change. Not long ago, Barack Obama, while still president at the North America's Leaders Summit in June 2016, he took umbrage with the notion that Trump be called a populist. How could Trump be called a populist? He doesn't care about working people. If anything, Obama argued, he was the populist. If anything, Obama argued, Bernie was the populist. It was Bernie who'd spent 5 decades fighting for working people. But Trump. Something curious happens. If you watch Obama's speeches after that point, more and more recently, he uses the word populist interchangeably with strongman, with authoritarian. The word changes meaning. It becomes a negative, a pejorative, a slur. To me, populism is not a dirty word. Since the 2008 crash, and specifically the trillion-dollar Wall Street bailout, we are in the populist age. And for good reason. The elites have failed. Let me address some common fallacies, some of which have been made tonight. If the motion was that demagoguery was a threat to democracy, I would be on that side of the House. If the motion was that political violence was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House. January 6th has been mentioned. A dark day for America indeed. And I'm sure Congresswoman Pelosi will agree that the entire month of June 2020, when the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon was under siege and under insurrection by radical progressives, those too were dark days for America. Yes?
There is no equivalence there. So, yes.
So you don't agree? That's fine, you don't agree, that's fine.
But it is not like what happened on January 6th, which was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
So you don't agree? But you'll condemn those days. My point, though, is that all political movements are susceptible to violence and indeed insurrection. And if we were arguing that fascism was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House. Indeed, the current populist age is a movement against fascism. I've got quite a lot to get through. Populism, as you know, is the politics of the ordinary people against an elite. Populism is not a threat to democracy. Populism is democracy. And why else have universal suffrage if not to keep elites in check? Ladies and gentlemen, given the success of Trump, and more recently Javier Milei taking a chainsaw to the state behemoth of Argentina's bureaucratic monster, you'd be mistaken for thinking this was a right-wing populist age. But that would be ignoring Occupy Wall Street. That would be ignoring Jeremy Corbyn's for the many, not the few. That would be ignoring Bernie against the billionaires, RFK Jr. against Big Pharma, and more recently, George Galloway against his better judgment. Now, all of them, including Galloway, recognize genuine concerns of ordinary people being otherwise ignored by the establishment. I'm actually rather surprised that our esteemed opposition, Congressman Pelosi, is on that side of the motion. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-elite. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-establishment. Today, particularly in America, the globalist left have become the establishment. I suppose for Ms. Pelosi to have taken this side of the motion, she'd be arguing herself out of a job. But it's here in Britain where right and left populists united for the supreme act of democracy, Brexit. Polls have showed the number one reason people voted for Brexit was sovereignty, for more democracy.
Point of information.
Thank you. What was the response of the Brussels elite? They did everything in their power to undermine the democratic will of the British people, and the Westminster elite were just as disgraceful. As we've heard, David Cameron called the voters fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists. The Liberal Democrats did everything they could to overturn a democratic vote. Keir Starmer campaigned for a second referendum. Elites would have had us voting and voting and voting until we voted their way. Indeed, that's what happened in Ireland and in Denmark. Let's look at some of the other populist movements. The Hong Konger populist revolt is literally called the pro-democracy movement. The farmer revolts from Netherlands to Germany, France, Greece to Sri Lanka. Farmers are taking their tractors to the road to protest ESG policy that's floated down to us from those all-knowing, infallible elites of Davos. The trucker movement in Canada became anti-elitist when petty tyrant Prime Minister Justin Trudeau froze their bank accounts, not the behavior of a democratic head of state. The Gilets jaunes in France, ULEZ in London, working people protesting policy that hurt them. And how are they treated? They're called conspiracy theorists. They're called far right, by the mayor as well. Ladies and gentlemen, populism is the voice of the voiceless. The real threat to democracy is from the elites. Now, don't get me wrong, we need elites. If President Biden has shown us anything, we need someone to run the countries. When the president has severe dementia, it's not just America that crumbles, the whole world burns. But let's examine the elites. European corporations spend over 1 billion euros a year lobbying Brussels. US corporations spend over $2 billion a year lobbying in DC. 2/3 of Congress receive funding from pharmaceutical companies. Pfizer alone spent $11 million in 2021. They made over $10 billion in profit. No wonder then that 66% of Americans think the economy is rigged against them for the rich and the powerful. And by the way, we used to have a word for when big business and big government were in cahoots. And I think any students here of early 20th century Italian history know what I'm talking about. What about big tech? Throughout the pandemic, Biden's team, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security colluded with big tech in censoring dissenting voices, not kooky conspiracy theorists. People like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, the Stanford epidemiologist. People like Harvard scientist Martin Kulldorff. People spreading true information, not misinformation, true information at odds with the government narrative. Need I remind you, democracy without free speech is not democracy. This was a direct breach, by the way, of the First Amendment. Before COVID, intelligence services colluded with big tech to have Trump suspended off Twitter. Yes, the same platform which hosted the Taliban and Ayatollah deaf to Israel Khomeini, they thought the president crossed the line when he tweeted on Jan 6th, quote, "Remain peaceful, no violence, respect the law and our great men and women in blue." That's a quote. You may be thinking now that Trump is a populist. You are right. He didn't accept the 2020 elections, and he should have. So should Hillary in 2016, so should Brussels, and so should Westminster in 2016, and so too should Congresswoman Pelosi, instead of saying the 2016 election was, quote, hijacked. Quote, hijacked.
Thank you.
That we don't accept the results of.
Okay. What about the mainstream media? Let me read you some mainstream media headlines. The New Yorker, the day before the 2016 election. The case against democracy. The Washington Post, the day after the election. The problem with our government is democracy. The LA Times, June 2017. The British election is a reminder of the perils of too much democracy. Vox, June 2017. The two eminent political scientists say the problem with democracy is voters. New York Times, June 2017. The problem with participatory democracy is the participants. Mainstream media elites are part of a class who don't just disdain populism, they disdain the people. If the Democrats had put half their energy into delivering for the people, Trump wouldn't even have a chance in 2024. He shouldn't have a chance. You've had power for 4 years. From the fabricated Steele dossier to trying to take him off the ballot in both Maine and Colorado, the Democrats are the anti-Democrat party. All we need now is the Republicans to come out as the pro-monarchist party. Ladies and gentlemen, populism is not a threat to democracy, but I'll tell you what is. It's elites ordering social media to censor political opponents. It's police shutting down dissenters, be it anti-monarchists in this country or gender-critical voices here, or last week in Brussels, the National Conservative movement. I'll tell you what is a threat to democracy. It's Brussels, DC, Westminster, the mainstream media, big tech, big pharma, corporate collusion, and the Davos cronies. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off ordinary people as deplorable. The threat to democracy comes from those who smear working people as racist. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off working people as populists. And I'll say one last thing. This populist age can be brought to an end at the snap of a finger. All that needs to be done is for elites to start listening to, respecting, and, God forbid, working for ordinary people. Thank you.
And wish everyone a happy, healthy, and safe New Year. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Happy Kwanzaa. Happy Hanukkah.